The door of massive oak, adorned with gilded carving, at that moment seemed not an entrance to chambers, but a gateway to another reality. In the corridors of the Winter Palace, there was a resonant, tense silence, broken only by the measured ticking of an English grandfather clock. On the dial, the hands relentlessly approached midnight. The young officer, standing before this door, nervously adjusted his impeccably tailored uniform. His palms, accustomed to gripping the hilt of a sword, were now treacherously damp. He knew that behind this door, not just his fate was being decided, but possibly the future of the entire empire. He was about to undergo an examination whispered about in all European capitals, from foggy London to lavish Paris. An examination where failure meant oblivion and exile to a remote estate, while success promised power comparable only to that of a monarch. This was not a military council or a diplomatic reception. This was the antechamber of Anna Stepanovna Protasova, a woman whose name struck awe in the guards, for she was the keeper of the keys to the empress's bedroom. In the air hung a heavy scent of wax, expensive French perfumes, and invisible fear. The candidate knew. He was not being evaluated as a person, not as a strategist, and not even as a nobleman. He was being evaluated as a living instrument that must function flawlessly. This was an era when the boundaries between state duty and intimate proximity had finally blurred, turning into a complex, bureaucratic, and incredibly expensive mechanism. The history we are accustomed to perceiving through the prism of salacious anecdotes and gossip, in reality, concealed beneath it a harsh, cynical, yet in its own way logical system of governing a gigantic state. We enter a world where feelings were measured by gold, and politics was made in alcove. The Russian Empire of the second half of the 18th century represented a unique phenomenon on the world stage. It was a state that was rapidly expanding, absorbing new territories and peoples, a state that craved recognition of its enlightenment, yet was governed by methods rooted in deep archaism. At the apex of this pyramid stood a woman who had not a drop of Russian blood in her veins, but became the brightest embodiment of Russian autocracy. Catherine the Great, born Sophia Augusta Frederica Anhalt-Zerbst, came to power through a palace coup, through the elimination of her own husband. This original sin of her reign forever defined her attitude towards people. She knew that loyalty was a commodity with an expiration date. She understood that loneliness on the throne was a sentence. She needed not just lovers, she needed comrades, devoted to her not out of fear, but out of gratitude and, possibly, love. But how to find sincerity in a world of hypocrisy? How to distinguish between one who loves a woman and one who lusts for a crown? Catherine found the answer to this question in the creation of a unique institution of favoritism. This was not an invention of the Russian empress. French kings had kept official mistresses for centuries. But Catherine, being a woman of great intellect and masculine logic, turned this scheme on its head. If a king maintained a harem for pleasure, the empress created a personnel reserve. She was looking for support. And to ensure this support did not falter at the most crucial moment, a rigorous quality control was introduced. This is where the myths about the mirror room and the very real figure of the tester come into play. In public consciousness, these details are often mixed into a grotesque picture. But if we discard the moralizing of the 19th century, we will see the cold calculation of the 18th century. The system was finely tuned to automatism. When the current favorite lost his influence or, as often happened, passed away, a vacancy appeared on the horizon. Candidates were carefully selected. These were usually recommendations from trusted individuals, primarily Prince Potemkin, who, even after the cessation of intimate relations with the empress, remained her chief advisor and, in fact, co-ruler. He understood that Catherine needed a certain type: young, handsome, not too intelligent, so as not to meddle in high politics without being asked, but educated enough to hold a conversation. Once a candidate was found, a multi-stage vetting process began. The first stage was a medical examination. Dr. John Rogerson, Her Majesty's Lebe Medic, court physician, personally examined the claimant. In an era when dangerous diseases decimated the aristocracy as mercilessly as commoners, the favorite's health was a matter of national security. Any infection transmitted to the empress could lead to a catastrophe of dynastic proportions. If the candidate was deemed physically healthy, the second stage began: testing of abilities. And here, Countess Anna Protasova played a key role. This woman, who had served the empress for many years, held an unofficial but well-known title of L'Éprouveuse, the tester. For 3 nights, she verified the candidate's masculine prowess. This was not promiscuity in the understanding of the participants in the process. It was a service. Protasova had to ensure that the officer was not only healthy, but also resilient, temperamental, and capable of satisfying the demanding sovereign. Protasova's report decided the young man's fate. If the verdict was positive, the candidate received the official status of favorite, moved into special chambers of the Winter Palace, connected to the imperial bedroom by a spiral staircase, and received the first gigantic reward. The sums spent on maintaining this male harem are astonishing even today. An initial bonus could be 100,000 rubles, colossal money, enough to build a palace or equip several regiments. Monthly maintenance, gifts, jewels, estates with thousands of serf souls, all this poured down on the favorites like a golden rain. Examining the financial reports of Her Imperial Majesty's cabinet, historians stumble upon dry figures. Quote 1, quote 2. Behind these lines lie the fates of people plucked from obscurity and elevated to the heights. However, this quote 3 left quite material, majestic traces on the body of the empire, transforming caprice into legacy. The Marble Palace in St. Petersburg was built for Grigory Orlov, the Tauride Palace for Potemkin. These are architectural masterpieces that are now the pride of Russia. They were built with quote, _for, with the very funds allocated from the treasury to the favorites. Paradoxically, the empress's personal expenses turned into the cultural enrichment of the country. Diamonds gifted to favorites partially returned to the treasury after their demise or confiscation, partially settled in private collections, becoming artistic treasures. Even here, Catherine managed, albeit inadvertently, to serve eternity. Historians have calculated that over 90 million rubles were spent on favorites during Catherine's entire reign. For comparison, the annual budget of the entire empire at that time rarely exceeded 60 to 80 million. But Catherine considered these expenses justified. She was not just buying a body, she was buying loyalty, tranquility, and the illusion of eternal youth. Behind the external glitter and golden dust lay a deep drama. Catherine's internal conflict was the conflict of a woman who wanted to be loved and a ruler who could not afford weakness. Each new favorite was an attempt to find an ideal partner. In her early days, she sought equals. Grigory Orlov, who helped her ascend the throne, was audacious, brave, but too simple and crude for the refined German woman. Grigory Potemkin became perhaps the only one who matched her in terms of personality. Their romance was tumultuous, full of passion and intellectual unity. There is a version that they were secretly married. But two bears in one den, two leaders in one palace, that was too difficult. Their relationship transformed into a unique political alliance, where passion gave way to deep respect and partnership. Potemkin supplied her with new favorites, understanding that physical intimacy for Catherine was a way of relaxation, not a reason for redistributing power. However, not all favorites were mere playthings or political partners. Among this succession of individuals was a man whose story reveals Catherine from her most unexpected, vulnerable side: Alexander Lanskoy. He did not strive for power, did not intrigue, did not ask for orders. He simply loved her, a woman who was almost 30 years his senior, and she reciprocated. This was the golden age of her heart. Lanskoy was interested in the arts, read to her aloud for hours, and was an ideal conversationalist. But fate is cruel to those who are happy. Alexander Lanskoy died in the prime of his life, barely past his 25th birthday, consumed by illness. His death crushed Catherine more severely than any military defeats. She mourned, was unable to attend to affairs, and plunged into the deepest depression. In letters from that period, we see not an empress, but a woman shattered by grief. "I am plunged into deep sorrow. My happiness is no more." This was the sincere grief of a woman who had lost her beloved, not a mistress who had lost a servant. In such moments, the mask of the omnipotent autocrat fell away, revealing a vulnerable soul. But the state machine did not tolerate stoppages. Ministers demanded signatures, ambassadors awaited audiences, and Catherine, overcoming her pain, again put on her mask. Again she summoned Protasova, and the wheel of favoritism made another turn, becoming increasingly cynical with each passing time. Over the years, this search for an ideal turned into an escape from old age. The favorites became younger and younger, and the age difference became more and more frightening. If Orloff was her contemporary and Potemkin only slightly younger, then her last chosen ones were young enough to be her grandsons. A 20-year-old youth and a 60-year-old woman. In this union, there was no longer a search for an intellectual partner. There was only a desperate attempt at a vampiric absorption of another's youth. Here we approach a deep philosophical and political conflict. Catherine positioned herself as an enlightened sovereign, a student of Voltaire and Diderot. She wrote, pondered laws and justice. But her personal life was a complete negation of the bourgeois morality that was beginning to emerge in Europe. She lived by the laws of absolutism, where the monarch's body is sacred and his desires are law. The paradox was that, while preaching the ideas of reason, she created a system based on the body. Favoritism became an institution that replaced normal state mechanisms. Access to the empress's body meant access to the budget, to foreign policy decisions, to the distribution of ranks. The influence of these knight counselors on foreign policy was colossal and not always beneficial. While Potemkin thought strategically, designing the Greek project and dreaming of the revival of Byzantium under the Romanov scepter, other favorites often acted out of petty personal grievances or sympathies, undermining the efforts of diplomats. English and French ambassadors perfectly understood the rules of this game. They spent enormous sums bribing favorites, trying through them to whisper the desired solution to the empress, to tip the scales in favor of London or Paris. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Catherine knew how to separate love and politics when it came to Russia's fundamental interests. but constant dripping wears away a stone. The constant presence of a person with a certain mindset created an informational background that distorted reality. Nobles saw that the fastest path to success was not valiant service on the battlefields, but a lucky turn in a palace corridor. Young officers dreamed not of exploits, but of catching the eye of Potemkin or Protosova. This corrupted the elite. It was precisely during this period of decline, when the system began to devour itself, that the darkest and most scandalous legends were born. The myth of the mirror room, or snuff box, became the quintessence of the European view of Russian Messalina. Travelers and diplomats whispered about secret chambers in Gatchina or the Winter Palace, where walls and ceilings were completely covered with mirrors to reflect scenes of love. They spoke of furniture with obscene carvings, of tables whose legs were made in the form of intertwined bodies. These stories, picked up and exaggerated by French pamphleteers after the Revolution of 1789, aimed to discredit Catherine as a monarch. In an era when thrones were falling in France, the image of a depraved tyrant in the East was very convenient. Did special pornographic cabinets actually exist? No documentary evidence, drawings, or property inventories that would unambiguously indicate the existence of the mirror room, as described by gossips, have survived. Most of these stories appeared after the Empress's death. But Catherine was indeed a child of her century, the gallant, sensual age of Rococo. Erotic art, frivolous paintings and figurines were the norm for aristocratic interiors. But the very fact of such exaggerated legends arising speaks to how shocking the behavior of a woman with absolute power and absolute freedom was to her contemporaries. This was an ideological conflict. Patriarchal Europe could not forgive a woman what it forgave any male monarch. The transformation of this system into a farce occurred tragically and inevitably with the passing of Prince Potemkin in 1791. Catherine lost her anchor. Potemkin was the filter that screened out outright nobodies and adventurers. Even from a distance, he controlled who entered the Empress's bedchamber, ensuring that these individuals would not harm the state. When he was gone, a vacuum formed. Catherine, aged, frightened by the ghost of the French Revolution, having lost her main friend, found herself defenseless against her own weakness. Platon Zubov emerged onto the stage, the last favorite. A man who became a symbol of the decline of a great era. He was young, handsome, but absolutely talentless as a statesman. Nevertheless, enjoying the boundless affection of the aging empress, he concentrated immense power in his hands. General Feldzeugmeister, Governor-General of Novorossiya, head of the Black Sea Fleet, titles showered upon him as if from a horn of plenty. Zubov interfered in foreign policy, intrigued, and was capricious. It was he who actively pushed for war with Persia, an adventure that Russia did not need, cost enormous resources and soldiers' lives, but flattered his vanity. This was a vivid example of how the personal ambitions of a favorite, desiring military glory, turned into a state problem. The old grandees were horrified. They saw how the decrepit lioness allowed a jackal to rule the pride. In these last years, the mirror room became a metaphor not so much for debauchery as for blindness. Catherine looked in the mirror and saw not an old woman, but an eternally young woman, worthy of love. Zubov supported this illusion, siphoning millions from the treasury. The culmination of this drama came not at the moment of some specific scandal, but in the silence of the Empress's last mourning. On November 5, 1796, Catherine, as usual, woke up early, drank her strongest coffee, and attended to papers. And then, a stroke occurred. In those long hours, as she lay on a mattress thrown on the floor in the dressing room, because the servants could not lift her heavy body onto the high bed, the system of favoritism showed its true face. Zubov scurried about in a panic, realizing that his power was melting with every wheezing breath of the dying ruler. Courtiers, who yesterday had fawned over him, were already turning away, casting their gazes towards Gachina, where the heir Paul awaited his hour. Zubov was nobody without Catherine, and he knew it. The entire constructed pyramid of power, resting on a bed, collapsed in an instant. Pavel I, who hated his mother and her favorites, upon coming to power, tried to destroy even the memory of that era. He ordered Zubov's chambers to be boarded up, and many things associated with the __0_ were destroyed or hidden. The legendary furniture, if it ever existed, disappeared without a trace. But destroying history proved more difficult than destroying interior objects. Pavel tried to bring order, to introduce Prussian asceticism, but the pendulum had already swung. The era of female rule in Russia ended, but the trauma inflicted by the institution of favoritism remained. Society had become accustomed to personal connections being more important than law. The resonance of this story is still heard today. The lessons of Catherine's reign and her bed diplomacy extend far beyond the 18th century. This is an eternal question about the nature of power and loneliness. Can a ruler remain human? Does she have the right to personal happiness? And what is the price of this happiness for the people? Catherine's story shows that the mixing of the personal and the public at the top of power always leads to the corrosion of the system. When loyalty is bought, it is worth exactly as much as was paid for it last time. As soon as the flow of gold dries up or the source of power weakens, bought love turns into betrayal or indifference. Moreover, the myth of the "two" and the empress's insatiability became a powerful tool of information warfare, which is used against strong female politicians to this day. Sexism in politics has not disappeared. If a male politician surrounded by women is perceived as a strong leader, then a woman who is active in her personal life is immediately ostracized. Catherine became the first victim of such large-scale black PR. The legend of the horse, which allegedly caused her demise, is the most vile and persistent lie invented to humiliate a great ruler, to reduce her state achievements to the level of animal lust. This is a lesson in how historical memory can be distorted by prejudice. A modern view of this story requires us to abandon hypocrisy. We must see Catherine not as a caricature, but as a living person of incredible energy and tragic fate. She was an Iron Lady long before the term appeared. She ruled a vast empire surrounded by men who constantly tried to manipulate her. Favoritism was her protective wall, her way of controlling chaos. Yes, it was an expensive and morally dubious method, but it worked for 34 years. She expanded the empire's borders to the Black Sea, annexed Crimea, partitioned Poland, corresponded with the best minds of Europe, and built cities. And all this time, she sought the warmth that she so lacked in the cold halls of the Winter Palace. Returning to the beginning of our narrative, to that very oak door before which the trembling officer stood, we now see this scene differently. Beyond the door, he was not simply awaited by an alcove, but by an entry into a complex system of coordinates, where love, power, money, and duty intertwined into an indissoluble knot. That officer could become a new Zubov, a destroyer, or a new Lanskoy, a sincere friend. he could become a toy in the hands of history or its creator. Catherine offered a chance. But the price of this chance was high, the loss of oneself for the sake of serving an idol. The figure of the empress, reflected in thousands of mirrors, real or imagined, remains one of the most enigmatic. The mirrors multiplied her image, but which of them was real? The great legislator? The loving grandmother? The woman mourning Lanskoy? Or the lonely old ruler afraid of the dark? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, at that elusive point where state necessity meets human passion. And today, walking through the halls of the Hermitage, where the heels of favorites once clicked and the dresses of ladies-in-waiting rustled, we feel this presence. The energy of desire and power has not disappeared. It has soaked into the walls, into the parquet, into the very air of Petersburg. Catherine's story teaches us that power is not only a triumph, but also an immense burden, which sometimes must be carried by two, changing companions at each station, because no one is capable of walking this path to the end on par with the Empress. Catherine the Great proved that a woman on the throne could surpass any man in the art of governance, but she could never conquer the simple human need to be loved, not for the crown, but despite it. As the last candles burned down in the Empress's bedroom and shadows deepened in the corners, she probably understood that all these mirrors reflected only emptiness. Favorites departed, dying or losing interest, beauty faded, and the empire demanded more and more sacrifices. The system she built became her golden cage, and the key to this cage she had long lost somewhere between state decrees and love letters. Ultimately, the story of the Mirror Room is a story about an attempt to fill an endless inner void with external splendor, an attempt doomed to failure but executed on such a grand scale that the world still cannot look away. Catherine the Great proved that a woman on the throne could surpass any man in the art of governance. Yet she could never overcome the simple human need to be loved, not for her crown, but despite it. As the last candles burned down in the Empress's bedroom and shadows deepened in the corners, she likely understood that all those mirrors reflected only emptiness. Favorites departed, dying or losing interest, beauty faded, and the empire demanded more and more sacrifices. The system she built became her gilded cage, and the key to this cage she had long lost somewhere between state decrees and love letters. Ultimately, the story of the Mirror Room is a tale of an attempt to fill an endless inner void with external splendor, an attempt doomed to failure, but executed with such grandeur that the world still cannot look away.